Today I'll talk about climate change risks to marine ecosystems and fisheries, but I'll focus in a little bit because Francesco mentioned I'm currently leading another project with fish in the title. It's called FishMIP. And I'm going to share with you some of the data and the results that we have done for all countries of the world on the level of climate change risks. And each of you have a little card, which I've just put on the tables. There's a QR code on the back for you to access the report that was published this year with the FAO. So with that, just to start with a bit of a brief introduction, we already know that changes in ocean physics propagate through all aspects of ecosystems. We already know that there are concerning levels of warming across all parts of the ocean, changes in ocean current patterns, sea level rise, particularly here in the Pacific, is such an important existential issue. Extreme events, this affects people's lives, it affects ecosystems. Those physical changes are changing the chemistry of the ocean and the base of all life, really, reliant on the ocean, and that includes us. So we know that there are changes in acidification, oxygen, nutrients, the little plants that form the base of marine food webs, also seaweeds and algae. We also know that the animals that rely on those plants are undergoing changes in their own physiology, with changes in temperature and oxygen affecting their growth, the reproduction, the timing of spawning, the body size of these organisms are changing. The interactions between these organisms and other species are changing in ways that we don't fully understand. So all of these changes propagate up through marine ecosystems and ultimately also to us. The one big issue is that although we know these things are happening, we don't have reliable data on the degree of these changes everywhere in the world. Okay, we don't have reliable biomass information for fish for all parts of the global ocean. So we're reliant on information from models. And so I'm going to talk mostly about the work that we've been doing using ecosystem models. And this also emphasizes from the IPCC why these changes are so important. I've highlighted the South Pacific here, where we've got from physical ecosystems up to the human and ecosystem services level. These are mostly concerning levels of change, which with medium to high confidence in the fact that these changes are happening. So it's really been highlighted as something that we need to act on. And we need models to understand what's happening and what could happen in the future, so that the decisions that we make today are going to be the right decisions for future generations to come. Okay, so a lot of our projections go all the way out to 2100, and we may think, gosh, that's far away, that's not really relevant. But it is relevant to our grandchildren, their children. And the decisions we make today affect how those futures unfold. So I'm really delighted to share with you some of the work that this large international network called the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project have been doing together, and we've been working for the past 10 years or so. We're all working towards this common goal of providing robust projections about the future of global marine ecosystems and fisheries under different climate change scenarios. And so we spend a lot of time on our computers producing results that inform big reports like the IPCC, for example. And the FAO is a different kind of report that we've been we spent a long time working with colleagues in the FAO, because not only did we want to provide our scientific information to other scientists, but we want to ensure that our data and our projections reach people in all the different countries, and so that people can use these data to try to help inform, for example, climate risk assessments in different countries, NDCs. Now we're moving into a zone of climate finance. And so our results are starting to get picked up by a lot of different organizations and national bodies. And I'll tell you a little bit about that today. And so you can scan the QR code to download the whole report. And I just want to say that there are many people who have contributed to this report, authors from 30 different institutes around the world. And so in this report, like the IPCC, we consider two possible future trajectories. So I mentioned the decisions we make today matter for the future. We're really uncertain about which trajectory we will go on, will be on, which trajectory we even currently are on, in terms of the level of emissions reduction. And so here we are considering two scenarios. One is a high emissions scenario, where emissions sort of maintain high levels, keep increasing at a slower rate towards the end of the century, but increasing nonetheless. And this leads to, you know, over 4-degree global warming on the planet, versus this low emissions scenario where net zero is kind of achieved shortly after 2050, and this is at the global scale anyway, close to maintaining within 2 degrees of warming, so in line with the international goals of achieving Paris Agreement. So we're contrasting our results between these two scenarios. We're asking, what are the consequences of these two different futures for life in the oceans, for marine ecosystems, and the people reliant on them, us. And so to do this, what we work with a lot of different people. We use our collective intelligence, I love that term, and we work with climate modelers who have produced lots of simulations under these different two scenarios, and we work with the different modelers all around the world that we have engaged in FishMIP, who all of each have different ideas about essentially how marine ecosystems work. And by using those different models together, we gain a much better collective understanding of the picture of how ecosystems are changing. It allows us to have some uncertainty. But ultimately, what I'm going to show you is how changes in ocean conditions give rise to changes in biomass. And this is, you know, by considering a lot of the different processes that lead to the production of big fish, essentially. But there are many different possible ways to analyze our results. And for the FAO report, we decided to focus on this particular indicator that comes out of our results, which is the exploitable fish biomass, fish being inclusive of invertebrates and other commercially fished marine animals, but that occupy a size range between 10 grams and 100 kilograms. So that's the part of the ecosystem our results focus on. And how do we do that? How do we actually use this collective knowledge and work together? Okay, so what's really important when we have a big project like this is that we have really clear instructions on what everyone needs to do, really clear data, and that everyone kind of follows those instructions so that it can all be put together in the end. And so we use a state-of-the-art ensemble of models, and this gives us a lot of different outputs, but we start with our 2 different scenarios. We know that climate models can give different future trajectories by nature of the fact that they themselves have different processes. So we've chosen 2 different climate models to include. These models tell us about all the changes in the ocean conditions, okay? So we've got, from these models, we have outputs that relate to temperature through the water column, pH, oxygen, the level of phytoplankton, the level of zooplankton, changes in currents. And so from this suite, I think we look at maybe 28 different variables. Well, these all affect marine ecosystems in different ways. And there are different types of models that exist that make different assumptions about how do these change where fish move? How do they affect species distribution? How do changes in the plankton and the zooplankton affect the structure of marine food webs? And so we have this suite of up to 9 different global models that make, that have different stories essentially based on ecological knowledge embedded with them, and gives us this more holistic picture of how these changes impact the biomass, the structure of the food web, how these things change through time. And because we have these different models working together, we also have different sources of uncertainty. That's a really important thing to quantify so that we can attribute a kind of level of confidence in our projections. So I've spoken about the biomass that we look at here now, because this is essentially a really big modeling experiment in the ocean, and we're imagining a case where we're focused purely on the impacts of climate change. And so our simulations focus on the biomass in the absence of fishing. And the reason for that is because while we know that fishing reduces biomass, in a generalized sense, but our results are still very relevant to standard fisheries management concepts and traditional fisheries management, because here we're looking at the aggregate unfished biomass in our projections. Okay, so we're concerned with this. We know that fishing will change things in addition to climate change, but for the moment in this report, we're focused on biomass in the absence of fishing. And we know that this could either go up or down, depending on what happens, because of the nature of all those changes all happening at the same time, affecting the food web, affecting the warming, changes in species distributions and whatnot. So we know that can increase or decrease in fish biomass through time. What we don't show are, what we don't incorporate here are how changes in fisheries management have happened through history or in the future. And that's something I'll come back to towards the end. I'm going to show you our results. Okay, so we did this, we carried it out, and here are some of the maps from our report at the global scale. And I'm going to take my time talking through this. So on the top row here, we have our projections to the mid-century. This is relative to the 2000s, okay? And on the column, so the second row here, we have end of century. So mid-century here, end of century here. And this is what our results show under low emissions and the high emissions scenario. So there are 3 things that kind of pop out with these results. First of all, that the changes in fish biomass. So we've got red being really deep red being stronger declines, and so the dark blue being stronger increases, okay, and where it's sort of yellowish, there's sort of not much change. And so if you look at the coloration of these maps, you can see different colors. So you can see that there's a general pattern going on here, that generally more orangey reddy across the globe, but very variable. Under high emissions by mid-century, a little bit more deeper reds in some places, but also variable across the globe. Now, by the end of the century, what's so concerning is that these two trajectories diverge pretty dramatically. And so by the end of the century, under low emissions, I'd say that the picture doesn't look too different compared to the mid-century. You know, not exactly the same, of course, but, you know, in terms of the magnitude of response, it's a similar picture. Under high emissions, this is very concerning. We're down with extreme losses in biomass for many parts of the global oceans. Very deep reds here, okay? So this is probably within the zone of adaptation for fisheries management. This is almost doesn't bear thinking about as just purely the climate change impacts on biomass. This is no fishing in the ocean, so this will be the background maximum level of biomass. We can divide up the ocean in different regions to look at all the EEZs and how they're affected. And so we've done this with this plot where I think you can see the, here again, red is decline, blue increase. For most of the EEZs in the world, we've got reds, and out to the end of the century, some of these are going much greater than a 30% decline in biomass. Notably in Oceania, more EEZs than any other continent go outside of that 30% decline. But the end of the century low emission scenario, most of the EEZs are almost within a 10% loss. Look, there are still losses for many regions, but within a 10%. This is, again, much more in the zone of adaptation. And I'm going to zoom in again a little bit further here on Oceania. And here we've got, again, mid-century, low emissions, high emissions. We can see by the under low emissions, the change is kind of stabilized by mid-century and, you know, looks roughly similar by the end of the century. Under high emissions, even by the mid-century, it looks a bit worse, even by the mid-century. And that becomes, again, very concerning for most of Oceania, one of the most affected regions that we looked at in our report. So very concerning, consider the reliance on marine biomass for so many people here. Now in the report, we go through and we provide plots through time for every single EEZ. And so I'm going to go through and just show you what we found for the Pacific Island countries and territories. And so starting with the Melanesia group, we see here we have the historical in gray, and the red is the high emissions scenario. Blue is the low emissions scenario. Okay, so if we look at Papua New Guinea, for example, that has extremely high levels of loss projected by the end of the century, 50%. However, this loss is reduced to around 11%. These are just the estimates by the end of the century, the mean here. A great reduction, still a loss, but a great reduction under the low emission scenario. We see a similar story for the Solomon Islands. It's maybe a little, that's a little less clear in terms of the differences, but generally the pattern across all of these places is that under the high emissions scenario, the losses are so much greater and prevented by lowering emissions, and we can see that again and again. I should just point out that the envelope here is the uncertainty that's associated with using these 2 climate models and 9 ecosystem models. And so the lines, the dark lines, are sort of our the most plausible outcome, the multi-model mean. And this is the variation around those means. And it gives us just a kind of an indication of a level of confidence, I suppose, in the direction of change. And so that's really important to consider as well. We look at Polynesia, we see a similar pattern as before. Look at all these red numbers. Tuvalu, Samoa, Tonga, similar pattern across the board where the declines are much greater under the high emission scenario compared to these losses in blue under the low emission scenario. Again, still losses for many places, which means planning and adaptation is still super important, but it is within the operational zone. Micronesia, similar pattern concerning levels for Kiribati. Interesting different pattern for a couple of these places, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, where we see essentially some models going up and some models going down. And so very, very high uncertainty for those regions, and there are a couple of reasons for that. What we found when we looked across the whole globe is that where there were places that had projections that were positive, so places in blue here, there was much higher levels of model disagreement, so that fanning type of shape that I just showed you. And so what we conversely found is where there were strong declines, we found very high agreement across the models, so high confidence in the direction of those changes where there are strong declines. There are different reasons for the uncertainties that obviously there are differences in the model assumptions, but one of the biggest drivers of uncertainties is related to the Earth system models, how they represent primary production, the small baby little plants at the base of the food web that fuel entire ecosystems. While the projections for things like the physical changes across climate models tend to be associated with high levels of confidence, their estimates of the changes for primary production or phytoplankton tend to be very, very different across models. So there's still quite a bit of ironing out in the climate models, and of course for us that's the fish food. So that propagates into our results. So there are some hot spots of uncertainty that need to be studied in more depth at the regional scale. Again, I'm going to highlight that these projections do not account for fishing activity changes through time. So this is purely the effects of an unfished ocean being controlled by climate changes. However, given that this is sort of the capacity for marine ecosystems to produce fish, which fisheries are reliant on, and they're so concerning, even under the low emissions scenario where we have widespread declines, it really highlights the need for precautionary fisheries management. And of course, you know, the topic of this meeting here becomes so important, because when we see stark futures like that, you know, I can't help but be worried about the conflicts, the inequality, ultimately that fuel these different behaviors. And if we're in a situation with even greater resource scarcity, you know, this is not a good future to look towards. Maybe I should be a bit more positive about what we can do. The thing is, we need this kind of information. It gives us a broad scale level of risk so we can start planning for the future, advocating in different fora for the oceans. Plugging our results, for example, into national risk assessments, which had previously not included much marine coverage at all. Making sure there's a marine component to some of the economic assessments of climate change, for which there is very limited coverage of marine and fisheries changes and projections. So it's really important to provide these data and to, you know, for people to start incorporating this in the broader national economies when we look at risk. So if you're interested in checking out our results, we've made a little web app here, and you can access it through the QR code. You can download data for any of the marine regions that we've included. And, you know, how do we actually more practically use these results? Well, I mentioned we're using these results in the National Australian Climate Risk Assessment. We've also been, it was requested that we help out with the update of the Pacific Community Climate Vulnerability Assessment. The last one was published in 2011, which was, you know, massive. And we've been working closely with the folks leading the Coastal Fisheries chapter in the update of this report. And, you know, so I showed you our results based on biomass, but the Coastal Fisheries chapter also incorporates changes in habitat, as well as our projections in biomass. And one of the key advances compared to the 2011 report, which was based on expert knowledge, is that this is now being based on quantitative model information, state-of-the-art model data. So we view this as a step forward, and also given that we look at ensembles, we have a way to quantify the uncertainty and confidence. Of course, we're always trying to reduce those uncertainties and improve, but this is the best information we have now. So this chapter takes into account a couple of hazards, not only the change in biomass, but also changes in habitats that are affecting mangroves, seagrasses, coral reefs, and to combine those two sources to understand the level of exposure to catch, to coastal fisheries catch. So we had to work closely with their team because what we had produced for the FAO report wasn't necessarily exactly what they needed, but it's been a really great example of how you can collaborate and kind of work out something that is fit for purpose. We filtered our results to focus more on the size range that's relevant for coastal fisheries, so slightly narrower size range. And produce results here, which are, for example, these are the Polynesian regions where we've got our changes in biomass. Their focus was on 2050 that they wanted to focus on. And we have the high emissions scenario. They also wanted to not look at the low emission scenario, but to consider the riskier end and the middle ground end, which is this scenario, which we had to derive because we didn't actually run that. But we worked together to produce these estimates led by David Welsh from C2O Fisheries, working really closely with the SPC. And so this is coming out in April 2025. It'll be launched by head of fisheries at the SPC. And one thing that sort of is take-home message from this is that when you start to incorporate both the biomass change and the habitats, you end up with projections that are, well, even more concerning, unsurprisingly, given the extent of habitat changes that are projected for this region. Our results are also being used in some work that's being led by my colleagues based at the CSIRO, who are working with Fijian communities and also in Timor-Leste, and to co-develop, I should say, adaptation plans. And they're working towards an adaptation handbook, but they're carrying out a lot of household interviews about the level of reliance on fish, but also other food at the household level, and to try to use our results combined with other data to work towards what kind of response, what kind of future they can look to deal with the changes that are being seen, and also to combine this with traditional knowledge, which is so important, especially, you know, looking at the deep knowledge that communities actually bring to this question. The work that we're doing now isn't limited to unfished oceans, so we're actually in the middle of simulations that do consider possible future fishing scenarios, including scenarios where there's different levels of compliance. You know, this could be relevant to maybe future catfish meetings where we, you know, have possible futures with different levels of illegal activity affecting the dynamics of the fleets in the oceans. So we've designed a bunch of experiments that we're carrying out now that have both the climate change impacts and different types of future scenarios that involve human use in the oceans. And so this is kind of running, I think, well, we've planned to be completed these by the end of 2027, so hopefully we'll, might have some results that could be relevant for before you end. What we hope to do with these is to provide much more detailed information on the vulnerability, risk, and impact and adaptation possibilities in this space for fisheries in the future. So just to summarize, our results project widespread losses, particularly by the end of the century, but extremely strong benefits of curbing emissions for global ecosystems and fisheries, essentially for all countries. This indicates that there's a really urgent need for climate adaptation planning for the Pacific region. I know this is not like new information for people here because there are a number of other issues already affecting climate change here. So, you know, this is an additional need for it to be so integrative in fisheries. We need to think of climate change when we think of everything, really. People can use our results. We've made them freely available. They can be used in government foresighting, adaptation planning, vulnerability and risk assessment type work as the kind that I've just shown you, or to just even help guide conversations that you might have about climate change and policies. It requires some careful understanding and communication of the limitations, the uncertainties, and so we're always here and willing and interested to collaborate, to work together to try to ensure good use of our results and that our results will be useful. And finally, we're tackling some of these key uncertainties that we know exist with more in-depth evaluation, improvement, and policy-oriented future scenario testing that involves the human, the socio-ecological component, as well as the climate change on its own. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'll just end there.